All right. Hey, everyone. I hope you're all doing well and staying healthy and safe and grounded as always. Today, I'm going to take most of this hour that we have for our internal weekly Q&A to talk about remote work and what we've learned so far and what we're planning on doing. And I'm sharing this now to give clarity to all of you, our employees. But I'm also live streaming this publicly today, which we usually don't do. But I'm doing this in case it's helpful to other orgs out there who are thinking about the future of work and how their companies are going to evolve as well. Now, I think it's clear that COVID has changed a lot about our lives, and that certainly includes the way that most of us work. At this point, the vast majority of us here at Facebook, about 95% of the company or more are working remotely at this point. And we've already told people that through 2020, they can choose to work from home if they can do their job there productively. And also with social distancing requirements, as we're looking at opening up offices, we think we're going to get initially to about only 25% density and capacity. So a lot of us are going to have to be working remotely for some time to come. And coming out of this period, I expect that remote work is going to be a growing trend as well. So today, I want to take some time to go through some of the lessons that we've learned so far, both from conversations that we've had and research that we've done. I want to summarize the results of the survey that we asked all of you to take internally, and that we had pretty good participation on. So I have some stats for all of you on what people are looking at doing. I'm going to go through some of the challenges and open questions because clearly we've learned a lot in the last 2.5 months or so, but there's still a lot of open questions ahead that we're going to need to work through as we kind of embark on this next phase. But the basic summary for today, if you take one basic thing away, it's that I think we're going to be the most forward-leaning company on remote work at our scale, for sure. But we're going to do this in a way that is measured and thoughtful and responsible and in phases over time. And the plan that we have initially involves a couple of big steps. The first is aggressively opening up remote hiring. On that front, the reality, if most of us are working remotely at this point, it doesn't make sense for us to be constraining all of our hiring to people who happen to live near offices that a lot of people aren't going to be able to go into anyway. So we're looking at that as the outlook for the next several months and perhaps a year. So it certainly makes sense to aggressively open up remote hiring. And we're going to couple that with a more measured approach to opening permanent remote work for existing employees. And there are just a lot of nuances to how this is going to work if you want to do this thoughtfully and have this work for all employees. So I want to go through that today. But as kind of a prediction for the future, I think that it's quite possible that over the next 5 to 10 years, about 50% of our people could be working remotely, would be my guess. That's not a target or a goal. It's not like I'm necessarily trying to get to that percent. But as we start getting into some of the survey data and you start to see some of the demand for remote work coupled with aggressive remote hiring, I think over that time period, maybe closer to 10 years than 5 years, but somewhere in the 5 to 10 year period, I think it's quite possible that that's where we'll be. I want to say something as a founder. As a founder, one of the things that I have learned some appreciation of is that culture is built very carefully over time. Products can sometimes get built in a matter of months, but culture is built day by day over years and decades. And I think it's really important to take a long-term approach to how we think about remote work, because this is fundamentally about changing our culture in the way that we all are going to work long term. So I think I'm optimistic about this direction, but I want to make sure that we move forward in a measured way. Now, at the same time, I also want to emphasize that I just think COVID is going to be with us for a while to come. So I think that means that we can't and don't have to figure out every single detail about what the long term is going to look like right now. The reality is that I don't think it's going to be that we wake up one day, on January 1st, and nobody has any more concerns about this. I think that this is going to be something that we're dealing with for some time. And our approach to remote work is that we're going to keep moving forward and learning and improving on this, just like in everything else that we do around the company. So I think that that's the approach that you should expect here. Now, before diving into the research, I want to talk for a bit about why I'm optimistic about remote work and why I think that this has the potential to be very good, both for the community that we serve and us and for the world overall. But first, I want to say why we're not doing this. I mean, the main reasons, we're not doing this because it's just because this is a thing that employees have asked for. We're here to serve the world, right, and to serve our community and to try to unlock as much innovation as possible. So I think it's really important as a North Star for this that the primary goal of this is to make sure that we can do our work better, not just to maximize individuals' flexibility, especially because we just have to take into account that the choices that you as an individual get to make also impact the people around you. So as we build our community and culture, we just need to be thoughtful about all of that. Okay, the reasons why I think that this could be very positive are, one, is it gives us access to a lot of new pools of talent out there. Right now we're doing pretty well, right? Recruiting in mostly a small number of hubs in big cities, but certainly being able to recruit more broadly, especially across the US and Canada to start, is going to open up a lot of new talent that previously wouldn't have considered moving to a big city. And I have some stats on that I'll share in a bit, but I'm very excited about that. It's also going to help us retain some important talent. One of the top reasons that some good people give us when they leave the company is that they're moving to a place where we don't currently have an office and don't support work. And being able to keep those key people at the company is going to be very valuable. In a lot of ways, improved retention is as valuable, if not more, than being able to recruit new people, because the key people that we're retaining are already ramped up on our culture and already have context. In terms of new talent, I think that there's also especially an opportunity to improve the diversity that we have at the company. When you limit hiring to people who either live in a small number of big cities or are willing to move there, that cuts out a lot of people, right, who live in different communities, have different backgrounds, may have different perspectives on things. And I think that this is one of the things that could potentially be very valuable. I'm also very excited about the potential to spread economic opportunity around the country more, and over the long term, potentially even around the world more, although we're not starting globally too fast. Right now, I think it's somewhat of an unfortunate and unsustainable setup that for people to have a lot of these jobs, they have to move to a small number of big cities. And that's both unfortunate because in some ways the cities are very crowded and the quality of life has struggles as cities try to scale. But I also just think that I would want us to live in a country where people can have access to opportunity no matter where they choose to live. And I think that enabling more remote work is going to be very positive on that front towards creating more broad-based economic prosperity and hopefully a more sustainable kind of social and political climate as well, if opportunity can be shared more broadly as well. I'm also very, very optimistic about the environmental impact of less commute and less travel. Some of you might have seen the stats that came out over the last few days that apparently some measures of global emissions are down 17% during the COVID period. Now, I don't know that that's going to stick around long term, but certainly, where I think that it's a benefit for everyone if we're not sitting in traffic, emitting carbon dioxide and into the atmosphere, and basically causing a bunch of long-term issues there. And I just think the reality, as we've talked about a lot in the past, is that here in 2020, it's a lot easier to move bits around than atoms. So I'd rather our employees and people be teleporting around using video chat or over time virtual reality and augmented reality than sitting in traffic and basically polluting the environment. Which gets us to the last point here, which is that, and this one is a little more specific to Facebook, which is that this moving to more remote work, I think, will give us the opportunity to advance some of the important future technology that we're working on. A lot of what we build are things that help people communicate and that give people a feeling of connection and presence, even when you can't be together in person. So whether that's the private social platforms that we're building with WhatsApp and Messenger, the work that we're doing with Workplace to help enterprises stay more connected, all the work on video chat and Messenger Rooms, Portal, and all the work that we're doing there. And ultimately, over time, virtual and augmented reality, this is all about a feeling of presence. And I think we all already use a lot of these tools for consumer uses. But as we use them more for work as well and eat our own dog food, as it were, then I think that we're just going to advance the state of that technology a lot more in a way that I'm quite excited about. And we're already starting to move in this direction a little bit. I was going to share some stats internally, but I guess since this is a public live stream, I'll share them publicly too. Workplace is now at 5 million paid subscribers and users. And that's up 2 million since this COVID period began. Work Groups, which we just launched about 6 months ago, now has more than 20 million monthly actives after again, just about 6 months. And we're adding to Portal a bunch of workplace and kind of remote work features. Historically it's been more of a consumer product, but we're adding Workplace video chat and other integrations for other video chat coming over time. And on top of this, we're also more widely releasing Oculus for Business because what we're seeing is that there's a very growing demand for VR-powered training and collaboration. So I think that if remote presence is going to be increasingly important for how organizations operate, it really makes sense for us to be living our values here and for us to be working more remotely as well in order to really build a lot of empathy for what our customers and the people using these products are going to see in order to advance the state of that technology here. All right, so now I want to go through a little bit of what we've learned so far. I'll just I'll summarize qualitatively and then I'll go through some of the stats. First, hold on a second, I'm getting a phone call. Well, okay. Seems like that was nothing. All right, what has remote work been like so far? First is a lot of people have reported higher productivity. Although there are certainly challenges that people are reporting, like having their kids home from school or just being alone if you're single for an extended period of time. But in some ways, people who've worked remotely previously say that even though they've had good productivity during this period, they've had even higher productivity working remotely in the past. But I think that has certainly alleviated one of the big concerns that we, and I think a lot of others had historically, which is whether during this COVID period, productivity was just going to fall off a cliff, and it certainly hasn't. Now, that said, one of the other things that people say is that while individual productivity the majority of people say that individual productivity is at least as high, if not higher, than it was before. People do report a lower feeling of alignment. So that's less ability to build social bonds and connections, to build culture. It's harder to have group creativity, things like whiteboarding, more free-flowing conversations. And that's going to certainly be something that we need to work on as we move in this direction, because those are important parts of company culture, of course. And one thing that a lot of people have said is that it's just unclear at this point how much we're just all drafting off of existing bonds that were built before this COVID period that have the potential to fray or break down over time. A lot of people also talk about how the less commute is a big advantage, and most people seem to be splitting their time between giving a little bit more to their work and giving a little bit more towards personal life. So that seems like a completely reasonable balance to me. But people also report that work-life balance is a bit harder, right? Especially because now if you're working from home, I think we are going to all need to be a bit more rigorous about drawing lines between our work and our families or our personal lives, so that way it doesn't all just blur together. It's very easy for it to blur together, and I think over the long term that would be unhealthy and not as good as it should be. A lot of people have also said that they feel like when everyone is working remotely, that things feel more egalitarian, especially for people who are in remote offices or some of our other offices outside of our headquarters in Menlo Park already. Because now, when you're in a video chat, everyone has their own grid tile, right? So it's not like you feel like you're video chatting into a meeting that's happening somewhere else. And maybe you kind of miss some of the side conversations, or you miss some of the chatter a minute or two before and after the meeting. Now it really feels like the meeting is happening on the internet, and everyone feels like they have an equal voice in that, and that's good, and that's something that we're going to have to work on, maintaining both the benefits of that and the benefits of offices over time. A lot of people have said that they think it's harder to onboard during this period, and I don't think we can fully measure the effects of that yet. We'll have more details on that over the coming months, but that's certainly something that we're watching closely. And of course, a lot of people have just said that they want to see other people in person as soon as possible, and I'll share some numbers on that in a minute. So overall, here are the basic survey results. Like I said, more than 50% of people say they're at least as productive at home as they were before. In terms of preferences and how people work going forward, about 20% of employees said that they were either extremely or very interested in full-time remote work after this COVID period. And on top of that 20%, another 20% said that they were somewhat interested in full-time remote work. So that's 20 to 40% of you all who took the survey said that there was some interest in remote work. Now that said, there are about 50% of employees, maybe a little more, who said that they really just want to get back into the office as soon as possible, and that's their preference for how they want to work long term. Now, we didn't ask people to only select one choice, so you were able to select multiple. Then I want to call out that the largest group of people, about 60% of employees, what they asked for was not full-time remote or full-time office, but flexibility and a mix of maybe 50% office and work from home. And on that front, I just want to clarify that these are somewhat different concepts. I mean, remote work that means that you generally, you're not in the office, you don't have a desk in the office, you're working from somewhere else. Maybe you visit the office for a meeting or an on-site periodically, but it's not kind of moving back and forth, whereas flexible would mean that you basically you have some schedule for working from home or somewhere else, and you have some schedule for working in the office. And today I want to clarify that that we're going to talk mostly about remote work, not flexibility, because the reality right now is we don't know what the offices are going to look like when we move back, and we're going to learn a lot more over the next few months. But certainly for the near term, we're not even going to have enough capacity in the offices to serve people who want to be there full time. So we got to get there before we can really start talking about what how we're going to be able to allocate desks to people who don't even want to use them a lot of the time. So I think that that's something that I just want to that I think we need to punt a little bit further down the road. In terms of remote work, the preferences that we've heard, more experienced and more tenured people want to work remotely more than junior people and new grads. In some places, the delta is almost 2x. So that's a big deal. One thing that I really wanted to check in on was there was no difference in preference by gender. And that's one that I really care about, because one of the things that a lot of people have talked about is when people work from home or work remotely, does that end up putting a disproportionate amount of domestic work and other load, especially on women, and would it be tougher? So I wanted to make sure that if we were moving in this direction, there wasn't some kind of gendered preference here, and it doesn't seem like that's the case. Another stat that I think is interesting is that of the people who said that they might want to work full-time remotely, about 45% of them said that they were pretty confident that they were going to move to another place if they had the opportunity to do that. And on top of that 45%, another 30% said that they might move. So that's as many as 75% of the 20 to 40% of people who said that they're interested in full-time remote work, who, if they're able to do that, would move to another place. And in terms of preferences, of the people who said that they would prefer to stay in the US, it's about 38% said that they would prefer to move to another big city. And then the rest said that they would move to a different kind of smaller city or other type of area like that. So I thought that was pretty interesting. We asked managers how they were thinking about if they had the choice to support fully remote teams. 30% of managers said that they would definitely support fully remote teams. Another 30% said probably, and only 10% said that they would definitely not want to if they had the choice. So I thought that was kind of interesting. All right, let me get into some of the challenges and open questions that we've learned. The first, as I mentioned before, was around creativity and culture. A lot of the work tools that we have today around messaging or video chat, I think do feel somewhat transactional. They're good for productivity, good for getting things done, but not as good today for building bonds or just being places where you want to hang out and informally communicate or share ideas or ideate and brainstorm. So one of the clear things I think over the next few years that needs to happen is there's a big opportunity to build new tools. I would imagine that the new companies will get created around this. Internally, we're going to plan a hackathon or a series of hackathons where a lot of people internally get to work on kind of, we'll probably call it some kind of like creativity hackathon, basically around internal tools focused on creativity and software interaction around remote work. Over time, in order to facilitate creativity and culture building, once we're past this COVID period where people can travel more, I do think that that's going to mean some more travel for a lot of people over time. Instead of having offsites where your team is generally in the office, but every once in a while you get together and go offsite and do something, I think now we're going to be doing on-sites where once a month or once every 2 months, teams are going to be getting together for a day or two or maybe more to just get everyone together and build culture and build the bonds. I think that that's going to be incredibly important to making this work. One of the themes that we've heard is that all remote work may be easier than hybrid office remote work. And that's something that we don't know how that's going to work exactly yet, because of course, during this COVID period, it's been almost entirely remote work. But some of the challenges that I'm very sensitive to as we move towards in the future, this model that's more of a hybrid, is we need to make sure that there are equal opportunities for career advancement for people who are choosing to work remotely. And the analogy that we've kind of used on this is that internally we have this IC or individual contributor track compared to the manager track. And at a lot of companies, it's the case that if you're ambitious, you kind of feel like you need to become a manager. But we've worked really hard at Facebook to make sure that that this IC or individual contributor track can be a really great way to grow your career. And if you're an ambitious person, have more and more, have more influence and impact over time. And I think that's kind of how we need to think about remote work too. It's not that you're going to be able to do everything exactly the same being in an office versus being remote, but we need to make sure that there are really good career tracks and equal opportunities for advancement and career growth for remote folks, especially in that hybrid environment. We also just need to make sure that the work environment is one where people who are remote don't feel like they're missing context. Which is going to mean some things like new norms around video chats. I mean, I mentioned before, you know, the value of having everyone have one grid tile, being egalitarian. I think the question is, what does that start to look like once people, once more people are back in offices? You know, is that an opportunity for product innovation where we can just automatically on the product side render people who are in a room together separately, or is that more of a cultural norm around how we use the tools? It'll probably be some combination, but that's a thing that we're going to need to work through and figure out. One of the big open questions is that we don't know what the offices are going to look like. So we know that we're going to learn a lot more over the year based on how COVID evolves and how this period evolves. We are committed to keeping our offices and making them great too. And I also want to just say that I know that shifting to more remote work is going to have some impact on our neighbors and the communities that we live in as well. So we're committed to our neighbors and to being thoughtful about this impact and how we manage it as well. I mentioned diversity and inclusion before. I'm optimistic about this. I think that especially expanding remote hiring, but also some of the work that we can do on retention will give us a bigger opportunity to attract and retain great diverse talent at the company. But there's one risk that I want to make sure that we're very careful about, which is that if we view remote work as an opportunity to engage more underrepresented folks, and if underrepresented folks end up being kind of disproportionately represented in remote work, then if remote work ends up being harder, especially in the early phases before we really dial this in, I want to make sure we're not creating any kind of disparity in how people can perform based on that. So that means that once we start going in this direction, we need to be very thoughtful and careful about the diversity and inclusion programs and really just ramping up and making sure the opportunities for remote workers grow quickly. So that way there isn't any inequity there. Another big issue is training for especially new college grads, but other folks who just have less experience and are earlier in their career. I think we know that new grads just need more training. You know, it's, you know, if nothing else, to, you know, they're learning how to work in a company for the first time in their careers after an academic setting. And at this point, it's unclear if this can or should be done remotely over the long term. One of the things that I think has been interesting from the research that we've done and talking to people who have been at companies that have been remote is that most remote first companies don't tend to hire a lot of new college grads, but we do, right? We hire thousands of new college grads. It's an important part of our culture. So we're going to start in a very measured way there, requiring that kind of training to happen in our offices, and then kind of figuring out what remote work would look like for those folks as they progress in their careers. Another open question that I just want to be upfront about is, I want to call out adverse selection is a concern that that a bunch of people have raised. There's a concern in some places that there are ambitious people who may not think that working remotely is the best way to advance their career. So I think we need to change that lens. I am optimistic that this will change between COVID and some of the advances in technology around remote presence, whether that's video chat, or eventually things like virtual and augmented reality, and also generational change. I think younger folks probably have different attitudes on this. But I do think I want to call this out as an area where I think we need to be intentional about crafting good career ladders, so that way we can attract the most ambitious people and we don't create any kind of adverse selection dynamic. I want to call out, in terms of open questions, cost savings. It's really unknown what the economics of this are going to look like or how much this is going to cost. And one thing that I want to be clear about is that I don't think that this should be done primarily for cost savings. That's certainly not why we're doing it, although I think it's possible that if this is done efficiently, it may be possible to save some capital. That I don't think should be the primary reason why this is done. In terms of the costs of this, it's one of the things that's been a little surprising to me in talking to other remote companies is that a lot of people feel like this hasn't generally been a big cost savings compared to what they expected, and that the cost of supporting remote workers has generally offset the real estate and other costs of supporting people in the office. But there are just different costs here. Remote workers need different benefits in some cases, including things like more tooling to make their offices work at home. If you're going to be video chatting in all day, then you probably need more stuff than just a good computer. You need to make sure that your internet connection is really dialed in, good lighting, good audio, everything like that. So that's one example. And we also find that remote workers may need to travel a bit more, not daily commute, but may need to do kind of more on-sites and things like that in order to stay connected with their teams, and the cost of that can add up. But on the other hand, I do think that there are opportunities, that there are potential savings from having potentially over the long term less real estate. Although in the near term we're not going to be using less real estate if we're only at 25% density for our existing offices. And then there are also things like food that I think makes sense in the offices, because we're trying to make it easy for people who work in the offices to not have to take half an hour to leave our campus and go somewhere else to get food. I just think that that's somewhat less relevant for people who are working at home, because they can presumably just go to their kitchen and have some food there. So I think people will need different benefits depending on where they are. And of course, there's also the different cost of living and cost of labor in different places. And one other unknown on cost is that we don't know if moving to more remote work is going to mean that we will need different numbers of people to do the same work. It's possible if productivity ends up being somewhat less, or if more people are needed to support remote workers, that we may just end up having more people, even if we are able to make it so that each individual person has a little fewer expenses associated with them. So I think the big point here is that we just don't know. This is an open question that I think we're all going to learn a lot on, and I'm optimistic that there will be some opportunity here, but it's not known. Okay, so with that all said, let's go to some of the more specific policies and things and principles for how we want to start rolling this out. And I want to start off by talking about remote recruiting. So the first priority, as I said here, is going to be unlocking remote hiring. Now, many of us are going to have to be remote for a while. So again, I think that there's no reason to constrain our hiring to people who just live nearby an office that they might not be able to use for a while anyway. So the first thing we're going to do is unlock remote hiring for experienced employees, especially engineers. So that means on the engineering band, that would be level 5 plus. And we're going to be starting in US and Canada. And from initial discussions that we've had with our engineering leaders, we know that there's a lot of demand for basically as many experienced engineers as we can find. There's lots of demand for remote IC 5 plus engineers. For new grads and less experienced hires, we're not going to be hiring remote for now, for a few reasons. First, as I mentioned before, we think that the in-person training is critical for ramping people up. And we can also, we're also able to hire our full demand for these folks from existing locations. So operationally, we don't think it's necessary yet to take on additional complexity of figuring out at the same time as we're figuring so many other things out, how to do remote training. So we'll kind of figure that out over time. Now, in terms of recruiting, there are 3 geographic categories that we're thinking about in terms of our recruiting for remote work. The first is people who live a little further out from the cities where we have existing offices, especially existing engineering offices. So, maybe say people who live, a 1 to 4 hour drive away from our existing hubs, and that includes extended suburban areas, it includes some rural areas. It also includes cities like Portland is within that drive from Seattle, San Diego is within that drive from LA, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh are within that drive from the New York Center. So that's the first category. The second category are new hubs that we want to set up. And when I say new hubs, these aren't necessarily offices. Over time, we will likely create some kind of physical space for the community to come together there. But the idea for these hubs is that we want to create some scale. So we want to focus the recruiting energy in some cities where we can get to hundreds of engineers. That way there can start to be a community. The people in that city can help support each other, and also can start really building a community where they refer other great engineers in that place, and we can get some return on scale. So the 3 hubs that we're going to start off building are Atlanta, Dallas, and Denver. And then the third category, beyond the range around the existing offices, these new hubs, the third category is just more remote areas. And we're going to focus our operational energy to start on recruiting in categories 1 and 2. So that's kind of the existing regions further out around the existing centers and these new hubs. But of course, for category 3, for more remote areas, if you know a great senior engineer anywhere, you know the drill. Please refer them. We're basically we want to hire, and we can basically we have demand to and work for basically as many great experienced engineers as we can hire. I want to talk a little bit about comp. As you know, our policy here has been for years is already that comp varies by location, and it's basically we pay market rates. We pay very well. We pay basically at the top of the market, but we pay a market rate, and that varies by location. So we're going to continue that principle here. So that means that if you live in a location where the cost of living is dramatically lower or the cost of labor is lower, then salaries do tend to be somewhat lower in those places, even though with a somewhat lower salary, you can often still have a better quality of life than you could have in some of the big cities. So that's comp. On product group leads, and we're going to have product group leads, and the business leads are going to have some discretion, at least to start, over which teams can be all remote, and which are hybrid, and which support remote work at all. So we're going to be deciding on a function by function basis whether, especially on the business side, whether certain types of work we think really can even be done remotely long term. And we're going to follow up with more detail on that. I'll share a little more on the principles of that in a couple minutes, but then we'll follow up with a definitive list on that over the coming weeks. Okay, so that is new hiring. Now let me talk about principles around basically how we're going to roll this out in a measured way for existing employees. And again, before getting into this in a lot of detail, I want to make sure that I want to ground us that our guiding principle here is figuring out what will enable us to serve our community best and unlock the most innovation. This will give employees more flexibility, but it is not primarily about giving and maximizing the amount of flexibility that an individual employee has. And I just think that approaching this thoughtfully and methodically, rather than just swinging the doors open to everyone and kind of figuring it out as we go, is going to help us strengthen really important parts of our operational culture that are just critical to maintain and build, like how we do training, how we do career advancement, how we execute across different teams, how we build this hybrid model that I talked about before, and more. I also want to be upfront that while discussing remote work internally and batting this around with a lot of folks, a lot of people shared with me some negative experiences that they've had at past companies. And one thing that's become very clear to me is that this isn't just about giving you the choice about how you want to work. Supporting remote work affects everyone that you work with. And I'm optimistic that we can make this a positive experience broadly, but I also want to make sure that it's positive for the whole company and not just the people who themselves want to work remotely. Now, of course, we also have the reality is that the vast majority of employees are already working remotely and are likely going to continue to for months to come. As I mentioned before, we already announced that if you can productively do your job from home, you are welcome to through 2020. And the reality is, even now, we don't know what's going to happen beyond then. And if COVID is still prevalent, we may end up extending that period even further. And of course, we know that some people have health conditions or their families or members are vulnerable in some way, and those folks will have to take extra precautions for an even longer period of time. So we get all that. So all that adds up to that. I don't think that there's going to be a single moment when this COVID period is done, when we just wake up and say, okay, now we're at the long term. Now we can put in place these kind of definitive long-term policies. So our main focus has really been on trying to give people the flexibility you need, along with giving you some clarity about the decisions that you might get to make in the future, understanding that things will continue evolving and changing. And our goal here is to eventually enable many existing employees to become remote workers if you want, but we want to roll this out again in a measured way so we can learn what's working and open it up more over time. But one thing that I want to be clear about is that there's not really any decision for you to make today if you're an existing employee. You already get to choose how you work through 2020, and through that period, you'll get to kind of figure out what the long-term plan is and whether you're eligible to do this. But I'm sharing these principles now to be transparent as we're working through all this. All right, so here are the basic criteria. If you want to request to move to permanent remote work, you will be able to if you meet the following criteria. One, if you are experienced here, which means if you're on one of the tech ladders, that means level 5 or above. On business ladders, it may be a lower level because some business employees start at lower levels than tech, so it may be slightly different for business, but for tech, it'll be 5 and above. The second criteria is you have to have very strong recent performance, which includes 2 meets all expectations or above ratings in the recent cycles. 3, you have to be a part of a team that is supporting remote work. And 4 is you have to start by getting approval from your group leader. And this is going to start letting some people transition to permanent remote work with the principle that if it makes sense for both you and for the company for you to do that. This is also going to help us realize the retention benefit for a lot of top performers that I mentioned before. One of the top reasons why sometimes when people leave the company, they give us is that they're moving to a place where we don't support work. And of course, if you're a high performer at the company and that's your situation, then we'll now most likely be able to accommodate you. But if your performance ratings haven't been excellent yet, we're worried while we're ramping this up about putting you in a potentially even more challenging work environment that we haven't fully optimized and tuned yet before we dial this in. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to open this up further over time, but that's where we want to start. The experience threshold also means that new grads are going to have to work from the office during your training period, as I mentioned before. Although I do want to recognize, and I am excited, that we have thousands of interns joining us this summer. In just, I think some might be starting already, and certainly over the next few weeks. And I know that you're joining remotely, and I have to say this probably isn't what you thought your internship was going to be. But our philosophy has always been that we take interns and we throw them in the deep end and have you work on real problems. So that's certainly going to be the case here. And here you have the kind of the special task of helping us learn a lot about what remote training will look like for students and new grads to figure out what will be possible going forward. Okay, so product group leads and business leads are going to be following up over the coming weeks. I think it will be sometime later in June or so, if I'm not mistaken. Although with a full list of which teams will be all remote, and which are going to be able to support remote work. But as a basic guiding principle on this, if you have to be in the office to do your job, you're not going to be eligible for remote work. So that includes people who are working on hardware development, where you need to use complex machinery. It means content reviewers who are managing some of the toughest cues around things like suicide and self-harm, or terrorism, or things where we just want to make sure that we can really provide the mental health resources that you need, and do that in person to make sure that people are getting the support that they need for these very difficult jobs. And of course, this applies to things like data center technicians and roles like that. Also, if your job just requires you to be near the people you serve, then your group as a whole probably isn't going to be eligible for remote work. And this, of course, is going to include parts of sales, policy, and partnerships, where your jobs are directly service jobs and working with external stakeholders and partners. You're going to need to be near them. This includes parts of recruiting. If your job involves greeting candidates at the office, it probably involves roles like HR business partners if you have to work with teams that are in the office, or lawyers who need to be near a court, or things like that. So that's just as a general principle, but we'll follow up with the full list. Let me talk about comp. Again, as has been our policy for a number of years, your salary will be adjusted if you change location. We have a grace period during COVID for people who are working remotely from a different place now. So we're not adjusting comp now, but soon we're going to need everyone to tell us where you're working from now, and at some point move back to either where you live, so we can do our accounting and taxes properly, or tell us the new place that you're living. We're setting a date for January 1st for people who are in the US for this, for when you either need to move back to where you were, or tell us where you are, and we'll basically adjust salary to your location at that point. But I mean, again, this is important for taxes and accounting. We're mostly going to rely on the honor code for this, and you guys all telling us where you're living, but we are going to put in place some basic precautions to make sure we're managing this responsibly, like checking the location that people are VPNing in, or things like that. And I just have to say, there will unfortunately have to be severe ramifications for people who are not honest about this, because again, this is important for filing taxes correctly. And if you may be breaking the law if you're not being honest about this. So I just think this is an important thing to take seriously. I want to talk about flexibility, because a lot of people in the survey asked for flexible work rather than remote work. So maybe like a 50-50 in the office at home. And again, I want to be clear that I think that there's a distinction between remote work and flexible work. And we just don't feel like we're in a position to make a decision on flexible work right now, since right now most of us have to work fully remotely anyway, and we just don't know what the offices are going to look like. And like I said, if we are only at 25% density, it's going to be a while before we can even get people desks who want to be in the office full time. And of course, we're going to prioritize that first. But there are also just a lot of long-term questions here. And how do we make the offices effective and full of energy if a lot of people who have desks aren't around? If different teams want to adopt different standards for when they work from home and when they work from the office, does that make it harder for people to transfer internally and limit people's career opportunities? That's certainly something I really care about. And of course, from a cost perspective, we kind of expect there to be costs for supporting remote work and costs for supporting office work. So I think one of the economic questions is whether there's going to be a way to enable flexibility without incurring both sets of those costs. And again, we're not supporting remote work primarily for cost savings, but I just want to be real that we are in the middle of a major economic recession. So I'm not exactly looking to add billions of dollars to our budget by kind of supporting multiple modes and the costs that are associated with them for at the same time either. So, all right, so we're going to keep learning, and we will keep providing additional guidance and clarity over the coming months. Now, I'm sure some of you wish that we could provide full clarity to you today on whether you will be able to do this. But I just, again, want to reiterate our North Stars here. You know, we're doing this to best serve our community and to best unlock innovation. That's what matters. We, of course, care about giving people flexibility and the freedom to work how they want. But the goal here isn't primarily to maximize your choice. It's to do our work the best that we can. So we need to recognize that this affects everyone here, not just you, and that the choices that you make affect the people around you as well. So we need to be measured about how we roll this out. And I want to say we're not alone, obviously, in having to figure this out. The whole industry is taking the time to figure out what is right. But what I can commit is that I think we're going to be the most forward-leaning company on remote work, especially at our scale. And we're going to do this with a thoughtful, responsible plan. And once more, I think this is an area where I think it makes sense for us to lead because of the products and technology that we build. They're so focused on helping people feel a sense of connection and presence no matter where they are, that it makes sense for us to live our values and our products. And I think we're going to do better work by doing that. I want to talk for a few minutes about what coming back to the office will look like. Now, I know that a lot of people, more than half said that they want to get back into the office as soon as possible. And in the nearer term,